Do you know how Proposition 19 affects the inheritance of real property here in California? Last week, we went over one of the key aspects of Proposition 19, and that was property tax-based transfers. And this week, we're going to discuss the second key aspect of this bill, and that is how it affects Propositions 58 and 193. Hey, this is Jesse Collins with Collins Properties here in Santa Cruz County. I help buyers and sellers here in Santa Cruz County and beyond navigate this amazing market we're in. And I also work hard to keep people as informed as possible about all things real estate here in California. And today, we're going to be discussing how Proposition 19 affects the inheritance of real property. Now, as a disclaimer, I am not an attorney or a tax expert, and I am not here to give you legal or tax advice. Before you make any real estate decisions where tax or legal advice is needed, please consult the proper professionals. I'm simply here to provide as much information as I possibly can on these topics. So what are Propositions 58 and 193? Proposition 58 was passed November 6 of 1986, and that excludes from reassessment transfers of real property between parents and children. Proposition 193 was passed March 27, 1996, and that dovetailed off Proposition 58, and that excludes from reassessment transfers of real property between grandparents and their grandchildren, provided all the children of the grandparents were deceased at the time of transfer. Both propositions apply to primary residences with no limit to their value. And both of these propositions also allowed for transfers of the first million in value of real estate that was not a primary residence. So how did Proposition 19 affect Propositions 58 and 193? Well, simply put, Proposition 19 largely nullified the tax shields that people gained from 58 and 193 when inheriting real property. Now, under Proposition 19, any real property passed down through inheritance to children or grandchildren will trigger a reassessment, but for one exception. This is known as the Intergenerational Transfer Exclusion. For more clarity on the Intergenerational Transfer Exclusion, let's go and see what the California Board of Equalization says on this article. As of February 16, 2021, the Intergenerational Exclusion allows for transfers of a family home or family farm between parents and their children without causing a change in ownership for tax purposes. That would mean a reassessment would not be triggered. It is an exclusion from change in ownership, allowing transferee to retain the taxable value of the transferor. It applies to a purchase or transfer of a family home between parents and their children if the property continues as the family home of the transferee. In other words, the parents must be using that property as their primary residence at the time of sale or at the time of transfer to their children, and their children must move in and be using that property as their primary residence within 1 year of the transfer to retain that tax base and to avoid reassessment. Now, there's an exception here. In the case of a family farm, there is no requirement that that farm contain a home that the transferee needs to live in order to qualify for this exemption. There's also a limit to the value that can be excluded in the case of a family home or a legal parcel of a family farm. That value limit is equal to the taxable base value of the property at the time of transfer plus $1 million. Now, if the market value of that home exceeds that limit, the difference will be added to the taxable base value. That might seem a little complicated, so they give us an example here to show how to make those calculations. So you have parents that own a home with a fair market value of $1.5 million, but their assessed tax base value is only $300,000. When the children go to inherit that property, they can add $1 million to that $300,000. That is subtracted from the fair market value of $1.5 million. That extra $200,000 is then added to that taxable base value of $300,000. So the new taxable base value of that property, once the children inherit it, will be $500,000. This intergenerational transfer exclusion also applies to the transfers of property between grandparents and their grandchildren with the same conditions. The only notable difference is that the children of the grandparents or the parents of the grandchildren must all be deceased in order to qualify for the intergenerational transfer between grandparents and their grandchildren. Now, there's some gray areas in Prop 19 where we're still awaiting clarity from the legislation and the courts. An example of that would be if there's multiple children that are inheriting property under Prop 19 from their parents, do they all need to live in the place as their primary residence, or does just one child need to live in the residence as their primary residence to qualify? We don't quite know. That is still a gray area. We need to await further clarification about that. Also, do the children need to occupy that inherited property forever as their primary address? If they move, does it trigger a reassessment? We don't know. We are still awaiting clarity on that. That's another gray area, and hopefully we'll have an answer to that soon. Does this mean that all properties, whether they are primary residences or otherwise, are subject to a reassessment if there is no children ready, willing, and able to move in as a primary residence? Well, most likely the answer to that question is yes. And you could see that that would cause a greater burden on tax assessment offices and quite likely a backlog of cases building up. So I highly suggest, before you do anything with your property that might subject it to Proposition 19, consult with your local real estate attorney and tax advisor and see what move is best for you. Thanks for watching this video. This is Jesse with Collins Properties. I hope you found value in it. If you did, please show the like button some love and subscribe to stay up to date with more real estate news. And until next time, stay awesome.